going to put an image down here and we're going to stamp it onto tissue paper. Normal tissue paper, nothing special, plain white, preferably as cheap as you can get it so it's not got any kind of coating on it. Very simple, stamping as you would stamp onto anything else. Inking up the stamp using, again I'm using the Versa Magic because it's a permanent when heat setting and we want a permanent ink for this. It's also a pigment ink which I find stamps better onto tissue paper because it's thicker. Dye inks are a bit thinner, so they tend to bleed slightly on tissue paper for some reason, so I always find a pigment ink much better to stamp with. Press down, gently, firm pressure all over, and there's your image. This image is a Zetology image. They do lots of really fun, quirky, random images, which is absolutely perfect for what I use. Now, as I mentioned before, this is adhered onto the cardstock using a wet glue, which means that we need to make sure that the ink is absolutely 100% dry before we actually stamp it up, before we actually place it onto the tag. Now, the whole idea behind this is that the image is going to look like you stamped it directly onto your background without any of the lumps or bumps showing through. Hopefully, we shall see. Now, what we need to do is to tear around the image because we don't need all this excess tissue paper, so we need to get rid of it. I also find, for some random reason, that if you tear around the image rather than cut, it seems to work better in the whole disappearing into the background thing. I don't know why, maybe it's something to do with jagged, irregular edges blend more into the background easily, whereas very harsh cut edges don't. I don't know. I just find that tearing seems to work a lot better. Okay, she's torn out. So now we're going to put her onto there. The adhesive that we're going to use, I find the best thing for this is Mod Podge again. Other wet glues kind of work, but none of them work quite so well as this. Right, this is where we're going to get very messy again. We need to make sure there's a really nice thick layer covering the whole space where your image is going to go. We don't want to miss any bits out. And we can position her very carefully, smooth her down very, very gently so that all of the tissue paper with the image on is stuck down nicely. Then we're going to put another layer over the top. The magic happens because for some reason the tissue paper goes completely transparent if you soak it both underneath and on top with the wet glue. And then you can't tell that there was any tissue paper there at all ever. Now you have to be very careful with this because what you don't want is lumps and bumps of glue underneath because that'll distort your image. So you want to smooth out as you go, but don't be too harsh and I don't know, don't be too hard with your finger because if you rip the tissue paper at this point, you'll have to start all over again. Wet tissue paper, as you might imagine, is really quite fragile. So you need to be careful, but also quite firm as well so that you make sure that it's adhered. Now, that, I think, is all sorted out and she's on there. Now, what you're left with now is a very gluey mess. With this wet glue, you can't dry it with a heat gun because obviously it will all bubble and it's really not going to work. So what we need to do is actually be a bit patient, which isn't very good when you want the finished result, I know, but we have to be in this case. Leave this to dry overnight and hopefully when it's all dry, it will just look like you stamped it on there. So what I'll do, I'll put this to dry and I'll show you one that I did yesterday. Right, we've got the tag from yesterday. That's now all the glue is dried and you can see, or rather you can't see, where the tissue was, so that's absolutely perfect. When you're doing this technique onto maybe 3D objects or objects that have got lots more lumps or bumps or curves, then this technique actually becomes a lot more obvious as to why you're doing it. When it comes to the gallery section of this DVD, I shall show you some examples of what I mean.